Let's analyze the factors relating to price elasticity of supply, as well as discuss how price elasticity of supply is related to the speed and ease with which businesses react to changed market conditions. And so there are a few determinants of PES, right? So these are factors that make a good or service elastic or inelastic. And the first is availability of stock or inventory. And that can be split into about three things. A good has a more price elastic PES when it is number one, easy to store. And so think like an iPhone. When Apple makes an iPhone, it's very easy to put in a box and just keep somewhere, right? Versus a helicopter, right? If the helicopter manufacturing company builds a helicopter, it's gonna need quite a big space to put it, right? And so as a result, there's probably a lot more iPhones in the inventories of Apple than helicopters in the inventories of a helicopter making company. That makes sense, right? And so the more easy something it is to store, the easier it is for a supplier to respond to changing market conditions. For example, Apple can always bring more iPhones to market if demand increases. Helicopters, well, they take a long time to make too. Is it in stock, right? Is it available? So think seasonal fruits like durian, if any of you are fans, or mangoes, like fresh mangoes, if any of you are fans, versus canned food. And canned food is around all year. You can go to your local supermarket and buy canned anything. Not the best for you, but it's there, right? Versus seasonal fruits, only there in the summer, something like that. And so if it can be in stock all year, the good is more elastic. Perishability, right? So if a good is non-perishable, then it has a more elastic supply, okay? And so an example would be like a cup, okay? A cup can be just held indefinitely, right? A cup does not go bad versus milk. Milk goes bad, like fresh milk goes bad in like 7 days if it's fresh, right? And so there's a higher perishability, and so it is a little bit more inelastic to produce. Now, services like hotel rooms are considered perishable. In fact, any service that's like plane tickets or vacation packages, all those are perishable because once it's gone, right? If it's not booked today, then it's gone, right? I cannot have someone tomorrow book a vacation for today. Doesn't make any sense, nor should it, right? And so something like that is very inelastic. The second determinant of price elasticity of supply is the productive capacity. Like, can I make more? That's the question we're asking. And so a good has higher PES when suppliers still have the productive capacity to produce the good. Also 3 reasons. Why? Because it might have a low marginal cost of production, right? So a pen, very easy to make, right? And very quick to make, right? Low marginal cost of production. And so suppliers can respond relatively quickly to changing market conditions versus an apartment building. I bought an apartment a few years ago and it just finished building like last year, right? It took like 3 years to build. So if all of a sudden there's an increased demand for apartments, suppliers aren't really that able to respond as quickly. High factor mobility. How easy it is for me to take factors of production, right, land, labor, capital, to make and produce this good or service, right? And so my example here is factory-made clothing, right? And so factories have machinery that can make clothing relatively easily versus custom tailored dresses, right? So those take not only a long time to make, but can't be made with machines, right? And so during COVID, there was an increased demand for masks. And so what happened was a lot of factories started changing the production methods and techniques and buying equipment. And in a relatively short amount of time, factories ramped up productions of face masks, right? Because face masks have relatively high factor mobility. Now, compare that to ventilators, right? So we also know that during COVID, there was an increased demand for ventilator machines that would help people breathe in hospitals. there was a shortage of those. And so as a result, a lot of people did not have access to ventilators. They got very sick. And the reason is because it's a lot harder to make more ventilators because they're complex machines that are expensive. And then third thing, is there excess capital utilization capacity, right? In other words, that's a fancy way of saying, are there unused machines, right? Like, is our factory operating 24/7, right? And so back in the early 1980s in China, there would be manufacturing companies that were state-run that operated a 8-hour shift, 3 8-hour shifts, right? So there's 24 hours in a day, and people would work 8-hour shifts times 3, right? So different people would be in the first shift, second shift, third shift, so the machines kept running, right? And so there was, in other words, no excess capacity. And so an example would be train tickets during regular season, right? Trains are usually not that full during a regular season, but you cannot buy any train tickets during the holiday season, right? They're really hard to buy and get a hold of because there's no excess capacity. Okay, so the third determinant of PES before we go into its relevance in business decision-making is going to be time period. A good has higher PES, is more elastic if analyzed over a longer time period. And so this makes sense. Also 3 reasons. Because of the availability of substitutes in production, right? So think about a car company. Now we know that there's kind of a rise in popularity in electric vehicles. Even just like 5 years ago, that wasn't really a thing. Only Tesla made electric cars 5 years ago. But think fast forward to today, pretty much every single car company has at least 1 or 2 electric vehicle. Over a longer time period, it's easier for companies to find substitutes in production, right? It's easier for companies to switch production methods and make another good, right? If you asked Toyota 5 years ago to have a fully electric car that looks good and is functional, they wouldn't be able to make anything that was good. But flash forward to today, they've got one. So that's the first factor. Now, second factor, number of producers over time. And so if you think back to the smartphone market in 2007, and some of you probably weren't even born yet in 2007, but I remember when the iPhone first came out, people were like, what? Phones without keyboards? With only a button? And now they don't even have buttons. But yeah, people at that time were like genuinely shocked that that was going to be the phone, right? And then years went on and people were like, hey, like Apple's got a good idea, and so let's just copy their design and have a bunch of phones with no keyboards or buttons, right? And so flash forward to today, there are a large number of producers of smartphones across the world in 2024. And so it's a lot easier, therefore, for the smartphone market to respond to changes in market conditions, such as increases in demand. Back then, in 2007, it was only Apple. And so for a very long time, Apple charged very high prices. I mean, they still do, but they were justified because they were the only one producing that one-of-a-kind phone. Third factor is going to be the time needed to produce the good. And so the shorter time it takes to produce the good, the more elastic the good is, right? Because the easier it is for me to make the good. So everything is comparable. And so think about like a bicycle versus a fighter jet. A bicycle can be made in a relatively short period of time, right? Versus a fighter jet might take years to build one. And so what does all of this have to do with business decision making? Well, a firm with higher price elasticity of supply for good means that it can respond to changing market conditions better in the short run. Okay, so we're concerned with the short run. Now, that's good, right? So I obviously want to be able to respond to changing market conditions. Now, PS informs businesses' decision-making. How? Well, a firm can, let's say, hold stock, right, to anticipate increases in demand. So for example, in anticipation of Christmas holidays, because everybody's going to be buying presents, different businesses will hold more inventory of goods. Or over the long run, they can expand capacity to anticipate persistent increases in demand. An example of this would be Tesla thinking that more and more people will buy their car, and so they build another factory in Shanghai. PS also informs the economics of a business. A price inelastic good may be vulnerable to price fluctuations from external events like natural disasters and changes in policy, the business cycle, and consumer tastes. And so examples of these goods would be agricultural goods and commodities. And so there's a whole derivatives market for controlling the price of these agricultural goods. Require a long time to produce and dependent on forecasts. That may be inaccurate, but made too far in advance. Right? So if a good is difficult to produce, then by the time I make it, the market conditions might have already changed. And so there's kind of an idea of the minimum viable product in software development. And in software development, once you have an idea, you want to make a prototype as quickly as possible and ship it out into the market. Because if you take too long to make it, the market conditions might have already changed by the time you make the product. And so in the same way, for something like fruits that take a long time, or agricultural goods that take a long time to bring to markets, we are dealing with a lot more uncertainty in the future. And it also might be difficult to produce and therefore command higher prices. And so some inelastic goods are difficult to make. And so as a result, it makes sense that they command higher prices. And these are usually luxury custom goods like private jets or boats or custom tailored clothing. So that's how PS can inform different kinds of business decision making.